Of course, in this class, we can never start talking about a story at its beginning. We've got to go usually a few years before that. So to talk about the United States and Japan, and or at least the Pacific War of World War II, we've got to go quite a bit before the Pacific War actually begins to lay out the groundwork here. So we're going to start talking about a strained relationship between especially the United States and Japan, going all the way back to 1919. Can anybody remember what was going on in 1919? What's that? Very good. We've got the Paris Peace Conference going on. It's the aftermath of World War I. We've got delegates from the nations of the world convening in Paris, and they're working out what will ultimately become the Treaty of Versailles and the other treaties to end the First World War. Japan was there. Japan was in Paris during the Paris Peace Conference. But they did not have a seat in the big table. And they would have wanted to be there. Japan is going to feel like they're being mistreated on a world scene. And they probably are. Japan is a country that is obviously an up-and-comer economically, industrially, militarily. They've been doing pretty well for the last couple decades. If you guys recall, maybe from AP World a couple years ago, you would have talked about Japan defeating China in a war in the 1890s. You would have talked about the Russo-Japanese War in the first decade of the 20th century, right? Japan joined the Allies in World War I, and they worked to take German colonies in East Asia. So after the war, Japan expected to be treated like an equal party at the Paris Peace Conference with the other great powers. And they would not be. So they feel mistreated, and they feel that most of that mistreatment is coming from the fact that they're Japanese, they're Asian, they're not European, they're not American. And they're right. Because the world in the first half of the 20th century was a pretty racist place with Europeans and Americans seeing white men as the leaders in the world. And they actually backed this up with the scientific evidence of the day that fit their narrative. This is not to say that the Japanese people themselves weren't racist in their own way, because they absolutely were. The Japanese of the early 20th century saw themselves as absolutely superior to their neighbors and superior to the white folks on the other side of the planet. But they didn't have any power on the global scene. So when you combine racism with the power to actually be able to do something about it, it's a pretty formidable opponent to what Japan was going for. To add insult to injury, in 1924, the United States is going to pass what's called the Immigration Act of 1924. The Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the Japanese Exclusion Act. This is an era in United States history. I already mentioned the racism. We are also going to have extreme nativism on the rise. Like, let's just keep Americans in America kind of thing. This is a rise of the second birth of the Ku Klux Klan. If you guys talked at all about that last year. We get the Ku Klux Klan starting to rise in prominence in Indiana, for example, and in many other states, winning actual government positions. So we get a rise in nativism in the United States. We get a rise in xenophobia. You guys know that word, xenophobia? Like an irrational fear of foreigners, fear of outsiders. Nativism is I am so down with my country, and I don't want anybody else to come into my country that would possibly threaten my country and change it from what it actually is. They kind of go hand in hand. They go hand in hand. So this immigration bill, it's going to limit immigration from all countries, but when it comes to Asian nations, immigration will absolutely be eliminated. So no Asians coming into the United States, and obviously Japan is going to be a part of this. Japan considers this American law to be an act of national humiliation. Like, how dare you not see us as fit to come into your nation when Italians or Germans can? So we've got some tension between Japan and between the United States. obviously on the rise. But what we don't have right now is any fraying of the economic relationship between these two countries. Because these two countries absolutely need each other. Japan, even more so. Japan needs the United States because we are their majority provider of natural resources like oil and iron and rubber. Upwards of 80% of those natural resources that Japan needs for its industry coming from the United States. And then on the flip side, especially as we get into 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression, the United States absolutely needs Japan to buy those things from us. What do you call this in biology? This is like a symbiotic relationship. They each need each other, right? Well, when the Great Depression hits, we've already spoken of this, so I don't think you guys need to rewrite all of this. When the Depression hits, nations start to look a little bit more inward, right? They start to become more protectionist of their own industries. And Japan will become concerned that their lifeline to the industrial resources they need could, on a whim, be cut off. You know, maybe tomorrow, maybe a week down the road, maybe a year down the road, the United States will decide it can no longer sell these goods to Japan. Who knows? So Japan becomes pressed in the advent of the Great Depression to find their own resources. And they will start to look overseas. Did I not put a map on here? I didn't put a map on here. That's awesome. They will start to look overseas. And this is going to make the United States nervous. In 1931, we of course know that Japan is going to invade Manchuria, just northeast of China. And the invasion of Manchuria is responded to by a League of Nations condemnation, right? Like, shame on you, Japan, pack your bags and go home. And as we already said in this class a couple weeks ago, Japan will not leave Manchuria, but they will leave the League of Nations. Yes, ma'am. 1931, Japan invades Manchuria and proclaims it an independent state of Manchukuo, a puppet state of Japan. Japan pulling the strings. Who's in charge, Darshall? Yes, he is. Thank you, Kevin, for reminding us that that is an important factoid to this class. So the Manchurian crisis is going to increase some tensions. But the United States, not even being a member of the League of Nations, of course, the United States will not push for economic sanctions against Japan. That is a phrase we should recognize, guys. Economic sanctions, we still talk about it to this day. In fact, in these negotiations with Iran, part of the issue of the deals with Iran is the United States working with Iran to try to limit their nuclear production, with the United States agreeing to lift economic sanctions against Iran. They're economic punishments. Your parents might do it to you if you get some kind of allowance. Do kids still get allowances these days? Or do parents just throw money at you when you need it? Man, look at you guys, living the high life. You have a job? All right, excellent. Well, okay, there's economic sanctions from your employer. If you don't do the work you need to do, they might give you less hours or ultimately fire you. It's a pretty serious economic sanction. They're trying to hurt you economically in order to get you to do the things that they want you to do or act the way they want you to act. Well, after the Manchurian crisis, though the United States wagged our finger as well at Japan, we did not start to restrict shipments to Japan. So we might not like what Japan is up to, but we still need them to buy our natural resources. But the move into Manchuria gets the United States nervous about the rest of China. From the early 20th century, the United States has adopted a policy with regards to China that is accepted by other great powers of the world, known as the open door policy. You guys can see it here in the cartoon. You got Uncle Sam at the door to China. It's a very fancy door. And this is meant to represent the open door to access to Chinese markets. China is one of those non-white nations of the world during the 19th century and before that European powers couldn't take over. All right? All of Africa was taken over, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and India taken over. China was never taken over. They were defeated in war twice by the British in the mid-1800s. So those wars were called the Opium Wars. You guys might remember that from AP World a couple years ago. But China itself, with its massive territory and massive population, was never completely taken over by European colonial powers. There was a rivalry between them to get access into China, absolutely. And that access will come by the 20th century in the form of the open door policy. That China's doors will be open to all. Everybody go in and do business in China. Nobody can stop anybody else from doing business in China. It is an open door policy. Not a lot of regard for what the Chinese want in this situation, but Western powers are saying, you go in and you do what you need to do. But now that Japan has moved into Manchuria, that is starting to threaten that open door policy. Because what if Japan goes into China and then slams that door shut to Western businesses? And that could be a threat. So the United States and Western powers are starting to be a little nervous about Japan's possible threat to the open door policy that we've long lived under. Yes? It was originally stated in 1899, but just think early 20th century. China is an open door for all. In 1937, Japan will invade mainland China. This is known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, or what some might consider as the start of World War II in the Pacific. The United States, remember, Franklin Roosevelt's not down with these aggressive powers pushing their will on weaker neighbors. And in fact, despite the neutrality acts that exist in the United States in 1937, we already mentioned that Roosevelt will open up arms shipments to China, right? And how does Roosevelt get around the neutrality acts? Yeah, this was not a declared war. This was just an invasion with no declaration. So even though some in Congress are going to be annoyed, the United States will start arming China to fight against the Japanese. But we don't restrict trade yet. Did you guys kind of catch the hypocrisy there? All right? Because what is Franklin Roosevelt dealing with? A nation that is still mired in depression. So while we don't want to see Japan take over all of East Asia, we also don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face. We don't want to hurt ourselves economically by refusing to sell anything to the Chinese. But that tune is going to change very quickly. In December of 1937, Japanese bombers will strike and sink an American warship in the Yangtze River in the midst of their invasion of China. In addition to this ship, the USS Panay, P-A-N-A-Y, in addition to this ship, the Panay, in the Yangtze River, 3 other American vessels owned by the Standard Oil Company that's doing business in China will be sunk. 2 Americans will be killed, 30 more will be wounded, and America is not very happy. Grrr. Sunk a ship, killed a couple Americans. This isn't cool, Japan. We demand an apology, we demand a payment for our losses, and we demand a guarantee that the Japanese will never do this again. Japan concedes to those demands. They don't want to be in a war with the United States right now. So Japan apologizes. Japan pays up. Japan gives the guarantee that they won't do it again. And the United States does not restrict trade, even at this point, to Japan. It's basically written off as stuff happens in war. And this isn't even a declared war, is it? But we do start to see a rise in anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States. What would be probably the strongest reason that the United States and Franklin Roosevelt won't push for war in this case? Where is Congress with regards to war? Non-interventionist, absolutely stay out of it. Remember, the Neutrality Acts at this point would be talking about, hey, American citizens, what are you even doing in China right now? Now, this doesn't fit because China's not technically a war zone because no war was technically declared, but that's where Congress is. As time goes on, as this invasion deepens, news of Japanese airstrikes, especially against Chinese civilians, start to become ever present in the United States. We get wind of the horrible treatment being inflicted on Chinese people from the Japanese. There's a book written maybe almost 20 years ago now, I think, called The Rape of Nanking, which highlights the atrocities of the Japanese army against the Chinese civilians in this invasion. And one story that really sticks in my mind, even though it's been years since I've read the book, is of two Japanese officers who start this competition to see who could decapitate 100 Chinese first. And they're going through, and it's being reported in Japanese newspapers and read by civilians back home. I think this was briefly mentioned when you guys read Flyboys a couple years back. I think they might have mentioned this anecdote from that book. And at some point, count was lost, so they had to start over from scratch. And we're talking just hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians losing their lives, and this news started making its way back to the United States. Roosevelt is furious with the Japanese treatment of the Chinese, but he's not able to do anything because it takes Congress to declare war, and he has no congressional or popular support for going to war. So what he will do is issue a moral condemnation. He's going to wag a finger. But not just at the Japanese, this time at American businesses. For example, many of the airplanes that the Japanese are using to bomb civilian sites in China are American-made. We make a lot of airplanes. We have a lot of companies that make airplanes, like Boeing, for example, at the time, that would sell airplanes to foreign nations that might be used for military purposes. So the U.S. State Department, this is a cabinet-level department, right? The State Department is what does international relations for our government. The U.S. State Department will issue a statement to American businesses that the United States will not see as favorable the sale of, for example, aircraft to Japan that's being used to attack civilians in China. We will not look upon that favorably. Now, why? This is coming from the U.S. State Department, and the State Department is a cabinet-level department. This is under the president. This is executive branch stuff. The president can't make a law banning this sale. That would come from Congress. And why do American companies still get to sell stuff to Japan, even though Japan's in a war? They haven't declared war. They're skirting around the Neutrality Act as well, right? So the president can't pass laws because of the Constitution, right? But the State Department can say to American businesses, the federal government will not look favorably upon you selling aircraft to the Japanese that's being used to bomb Chinese civilians. And why might that make an American business say, maybe we should stop selling these planes to Japan? Why would an American business listen to that? Sarika? People might stop buying. They might get unfavorable press. Sure. And who do you think a company like Boeing might sell more airplanes to? Japan or the U.S. government? Yes.
They could lose their contracts to the U.S.
They might lose their U.S. contracts, which could be far more valuable than any foreign nation's contracts. This is known as a moral embargo. It's not a legal embargo. It's not the Congress passing a law that says we can't sell to Japan now, because Japan is not technically at a war. There's been no declared war. This is not a legal embargo. It's a moral embargo. Like, it's not the right thing to do, and we don't think you should do it. So companies are going to start restricting their sales to Japan now. Well, now this puts some pressure on the Japanese, right? If America is now starting to actually restrict sales to Japan, Japan better work harder to create their own source of resources. And this will come in July of 1940. With the rise of an even more militaristic Japanese government, now in essence the military of Japan is controlling the government of Japan. Japan will react to what's going on in Europe. Someone asked at the beginning of the class, is this happening at the same time as the Europe stuff? Yes, and the Europe stuff is having an impact on what's going on in Asia. For example, in 1940, we have the fall of France. In spring of 1940, we have the fall of France. While France controlled Indochina. And so Vichy France is going to work out a deal where Japan can go into Vichy France. Indonesia is mostly controlled by the Netherlands. Well, what happens to the Netherlands? They succumb to the Nazis. So now Japan moves to create, and you got to write this name down. I actually added it to your standards. They're going to move to create what Japan calls the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Because they're not good at naming things. It's the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Now, first of all, think of what that sounds like. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Hey, East Asians, let's all stand together. Let's push out the white colonial powers that have long been dominating our society, and we will stand together in Asian brotherhood so we can all be prosperous, co-prosperity. We can all be wealthy. The Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. The problem of the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, if you are Vietnam, or if you are Indonesia, or if you are China, is this is all really about strengthening and making Japan rich, not any of these individual states. So Japan taking advantage of weakened colonial powers to exert their influence even beyond China now and create the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The United States will react to this. We are now going into a tit-for-tat kind of situation. We say, shame on you, Japan, for bombing civilians. Japan reacts. Japan reacts, we react. We react, Japan reacts. In July of 1940, the United States will respond to Japanese moves in Southeast Asia and Indonesia by passing what's called the Export Control Act, where we would now ban the export of basic war materials to Japan. And trade agreements with the Japanese nation will be canceled. We have finally gotten around to actually, by law, stopping shipments to Japan. Okay, America, if you are going to stop shipping things to us, we, in September of 1940, here's a propaganda piece that the Japanese created. Here's a little Japanese dude surrounded by a Manchurian and a Chinese guy, all waving their exciting flags of Asian unity and everybody standing together as a part of this Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Look at how happy everybody is, right? In September of 1940, Japanese, German, and Italian officials will sign what's called the Tripartite Pact, or the Three-Party Pact. September of 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan will sign the Three-Party Pact, or the Tripartite Pact, where the three of them will agree that if any nation is ever at war with the United States, all three nations will be at war with the United States. Yes, ma'am? It's a militaristic government. The military of Japan is running the government. It's not a civilian-controlled government. There's still an emperor who is revered as a god figure on Earth, but he is becoming more powerless to his military. So this is in September of 1940, the Tripartite Pact. All right. The United States and Japan obviously have some pretty serious beef with each other. So now Japan signs an agreement with Germany and Italy that if ever the United States and Japan, for example, are at war with each other, Germany and Italy will be there as well. In April 1941, now I want to fast forward. What's going on by April of 1941? We've had war in Europe start, right? In 1939. By April of 41, Adolf Hitler has taken over most of Europe. Do we recall when Adolf Hitler moves into the Soviet Union? June of 1941, June 22nd of 1941. So that hasn't happened yet. It's a couple months down the road. In April of 1941, the Soviet Union and Japan will sign the Soviet-Japanese Non-Aggression Pact, where the two will agree to remain neutral if the other party goes to war. Now, what's in this for the Soviet Union? No two-front war. They can focus on the West, where they've been, going to war with Finland, and they stretched into Poland, they took the Baltic. And now Japan doesn't have to worry about maybe a war with both the Soviet Union and the United States down the road. The United States will also have to react to the Japanese movement deeper into Southeast Asia after they agree with Vichy France that Japan can occupy Vietnam. Japan will take all of French Indochina by July of 1941. The United States will cut all remaining, previously it was military assets that could not be sold to Japan. Now we are done with natural resources. No more oil, no more steel, no more iron, no more rubber going into Japan. Trade between these two nations will effectively stop. There is no more economic relationship between these two countries. The United States will even go so far as to close the Panama Canal to Japanese shipping. So if Japan has got a deal with Venezuela, the only way to get to Venezuela for Japan is to go all the way around the southern tip of South America. Or Africa, but that's going a really long way. I'm going to hold it off there. It's enough for today.